So, this pandemic is causing a lot of us to reevaluate our lives. There was an article in Time magazine that appeared back just a few months ago that said that during the pandemic, 22% of people have moved or know someone who has. 1/4 of the American people, and maybe you're among that group, has seriously considered a career change during this time. Jewelers are reporting a double-digit increase in the sale of engagement rings during the pandemic. Everybody is evaluating their life circumstances and considering maybe some dramatic changes need to take place. The article goes on to say that we right now are facing a national existential crisis. The real prospect of sickness and death, the reality of our own mortality, has caused most of us, I think, to reevaluate and to reprioritize many things. That includes faith. Churches have been shuttered for months across our nation, which has caused a lot of people to also reevaluate the place of religion, faith, and church in their lives. I dare say, if we're honest, many of us, even in this room and that are watching online now, have wondered, after months of not coming in the habit of assembling together at a church building every Sunday, we've begun to reevaluate whether or not I really need that or not. I'll just give you an honest confession. This has been the first time since I was 18 that I had weekends off. And it was kind of nice. And so we start to reevaluate whether or not we actually need faith in our lives or not. Or am I doing pretty well without it? So this morning I want to ask the question, why faith? Our text is Hebrews chapter 11. If you'd like to look there, verses 1, 2, and 3 will be the primary focus of our study this morning. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now, the book of Hebrews, in a nutshell, many scholars believe that it is actually a dictated sermon, that we might actually have a sermon someone took notes on in the book of Hebrews. The context of it seems to be that Christians, I bet you can relate to this, Christians were facing a time of stress and pressure and even persecution, which caused some of these believers to begin to reevaluate the need for their faith. In fact, some were on the brink of abandoning their faith and going back to the old ways of life. So the book of Hebrews is a very relevant book of the Bible when we're asking the kinds of questions that we as a people in our culture and across the world are asking right now. As we reevaluate and reprioritize our lives, does faith need to be a part of that moving forward, or am I just better off leaving that behind? So, as we look at the text here, we're going to ask three big questions of verses 1 through 3. Those questions are these. What is faith? What does faith mean? And then finally, what does faith mean, but why should I choose it? So what is faith? What does faith mean? And why should I choose it? So first, what is faith? Now the passage opens in verse 1, and I've got it here from the King James Version because that was the Bible that I began reading whenever I was a small child, and many of the passages that I have memorized are memorized from it. I bet many of you are the same way. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen or not seen. I must be real frank with you when it comes to this verse. I have wrestled with it a majority of my Christian life. Because when I read this verse, it sounds to me, or at least it has for a long time, to be circular reasoning. It almost sounds as if the writer is saying, you want proof of the unseen world? The proof, the evidence that the unseen world is true is faith. It's like, wait a minute. How is faith, my hoping that the unseen world is real, how is that proof that it is? That seems like circular reasoning and hasn't been very convincing for many readers when they read the verse. So, as you can imagine, we need to look a little bit deeper at this verse. And if you're reading from other translations besides the King James Version, I dare say, represented here this morning are a variety of different English translations of the Bible, and you're going to find different words used to translate the word the King James Version renders as substance. Because really we have a definition here of faith. Faith is the substance. Some translations will say that. Some will say it is the evidence. And so anytime that you have different translations giving different English renderings, you know they're wrestling to communicate what the original text is saying. So what does he mean when he says here that faith is the substance or the evidence, the proof of things hoped for? Well, when we go down and look at the original Greek text, the Greek word here, hypostasis, literally means that which stands under. He is saying that faith is the underlying foundation of reality as you know it. The point is this, that the world as we experience it with the five senses is not all there is to reality. There is some other substructure, some foundation that is unseen, that lies underneath, that holds everything you see up. What is that is unseen, that is the reality that holds up everything that is seen? Well, for some time now, scientists have been really exploring what it is that upholds the physical, observable world as we know it. There's a study called the field of quantum mechanics, which sounds like the stuff of science fiction. In fact, many recent science fiction movies and comic book movies have capitalized on this idea that scientists have been exploring for the last many decades. The idea is that there is underneath the observable world, there is a subatomic world. And in that subatomic world, things behave in such a way that really are not observable and do not behave according to the established laws of physics. And basically, things are unpredictable and chaotic and really almost unexplainable at the subatomic quantum level. And yet, that level is what actually upholds all of the observable world that is subject to the laws of physics as we know it. So, some have said that the field of quantum mechanics is actually the place where science and religion meet. The point is this, even scientists now are arguing that there is something much deeper underneath that is very mysterious and almost unexplainable, that is upholding the physical world as we know it. Well, I know exactly what that is. Because this word hypostasis, which means the underlying foundation of reality, that the Hebrew writer uses in Hebrews 11:1, he already used the word earlier in the book. In Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3 from the New Living Translation, the Son radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God, and He sustains everything by the mighty power of His command. You see, what lies beneath is Jesus. That's what faith is. Faith is the living confidence that a person has that there is something underneath the known seen world that is upholding it all. That's what faith is. Now, secondly, what does faith mean? Verse number 2 talks about how that we need faith because really all of us deep down are hungering for that. We really are. We're hungering for a realization that there is something underneath. So let me just, before we move on to verse 2, let me mention this. So, as you know, our world is increasingly becoming more educated, more technical, more scientific. And you would think as a result of that the culture in many ways would be moving away from religion. In fact, some would say to you that that is the case, when in reality, the religions that are growing the fastest and are the most vibrant, even now in America, are those religions that are more charismatic in nature, type Pentecostal type churches. And you say, why are they growing so rapidly? Why are people so attracted to that? And I think the reason why is because we deep down are craving an experience with the spiritual. We're wanting to touch something that is transcendent, something that undergirds all of the seen world. We want to touch that. We want to have a spiritual experience. We're hungering as human beings to tap into the unseen reality. There is that hunger for that. But what does that really mean? What does faith mean in living a life of faith? Well, this way of faith, this manner of life, is a choice to live very different than the seen ways of the world. From the Message translation, verse 2 says, "The act of faith is what distinguished our ancestors and set them above the crowd." Some translations will say our ancestors had this kind of faith, which is what made them people of great reputation in the past. In other words, there is something about a person who chooses a life of faith that sets them apart, that makes them distinct and different from the ways that most people go about life. It's a distinct way of life. Now, I mentioned this just a second ago, but when you look at the trend of the way that culture is going in America, I think we all understand a dramatic shift is occurring. America seems to be, at least on the surface, it appears as if that many Americans are abandoning religion and that there is more of a shift towards secularism. The idea that you just live for the observable world, what you can experience on the surface of life. And so there's a lot of discussion in the news about the rise of the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. The rise of the nuns. That is, that more and more people, in fact, some would say that the greatest the religion that is growing the fastest, the religious group that is growing the fastest in America are those that identify as none of the above. On a survey, what religion are you? Are you Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, or none? More people are checking the box none than ever before in America. So we see secularism is very much on the rise. But don't be misled by the media reports that would say that America is getting less religious. At the same time that more and more Americans are abandoning religion and becoming more secular, at the same time many folks are still adopting and embracing a life of faith, and that segment of American population is actually in many sectors growing stronger. So that explains why we have such polarization in our culture. You're starting to see almost two separate groups in our culture that are very entrenched. Those that are choosing the secular way of life, life that chooses to approach the world from the seen, versus those that choose to approach life in faith in the unseen. More and more there's a polarization between the two. But whenever you think about, well, is religion on the decline? Because it has been said that, and this is a very common thinking, to say, well, the more educated that a culture becomes, the more scientific oriented that a culture becomes, the more a culture progresses and is more economically successful, that culture will become less and less religious. And the reason we think that is because that's what we seem to be witnessing in America, that as America becomes more sophisticated, more educated, more scientific, more economically prosperous, that it leaves behind, as some would call it, the regressive old ancient ways of religion for the more enlightened view of secular humanism. And yet, what is so interesting is if you look in a broader picture beyond just America and you look at the world as a whole, that is not actually the case. That we're not seeing the death of religion. Quite the opposite. Because as the world is actually developing in other countries where technology is also advancing, where more and more people are being more highly educated, you're still seeing a rise in the world of religion. Let me give you a few examples. Do you realize that in the last 100 years, on the continent of Africa, that 100 years ago, only 9% of people in Africa were Christian. And that has risen in the last 100 years from 9% to 55%. In the last 100 years, in a country like Korea, which is absolutely focused on education, technologically advancing, they were 1% Christian 100 years ago and now are 40% Christian. And think about China. Do you realize that in China today, in all of that communist repression, that there are actually more Christians in China today than there are Christians in America? You see, religion is not dying out, not when you look at the big picture worldwide. Although, yes, many people are embracing a life of the seen, a secular viewpoint of life, faith is very much still a real legitimate idea in the minds of many people and a way of life many are choosing. Now, again, there's the idea that says, well, if you want to be a modern person, you need to, in America, embrace this secular way of thinking. And secularism's mantra is progress, human progress. We want to move forward. Let's move away from those old antiquated things like the Bible and ancient religions, and let's move and evolve as a human race and leave those things behind, because what we want to do is we want to see progress, human progress. Along these lines, several years ago, and you may have read the book by C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, but in that book, Lewis combats this idea of secularism bringing progress whenever he suggests that actually, if you really want progress, sometimes progress may mean going back. Here's a quote from Lewis. He says, if you're on the wrong road in life, to be progressive, to progress is actually not continuing forward on the wrong road. It means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. I really like what Lewis is saying there. He is challenging and tackling the idea that says if you want to be erosion of character and integrity, and you see the way that a culture is treating one another, and you say, wait a minute, we're not on the right road. We can't keep going down this road. I mean, look at the things that has been happening recently in our culture, just over the last year. Turn on the news and watch around you and see what's happening. Are we on the right road? We got off the right road at some point. And if we actually want to move forward in a healthy way, we can't keep going down this road. If we want to be progressive, if we actually want to move forward in a healthy way, it might mean we need to do an about face and go back to something that can provide that. So why choose faith is the last question. What is faith? Faith is a living, confident hope that there is something underneath the seen world. What does faith mean? It means a way of life that you choose that is different, perhaps, than the crowd around you, but actually is a path that would lead to something more healthy. But then, thirdly, why choose faith? Because it is a life that is guided by the unseen rather than the seen. And we see that in verse number 3. So in verse 3, he talks about how that this faith, this lifestyle of faith, is a choice to look at life from the perspective of what is unseen, not just what is seen. Verse 3, by faith we understand the entire universe was formed at God's command, and that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. So, a difference between choosing the seen or the unseen. If you choose to live your life exclusively based upon what you can see, it is a life of utter hopelessness in the final analysis. Here's what I mean. If our universe as we know it is completely self-contained and there is nothing outside of the physical world, the physical universe, there is no heaven, there is no God, there is nothing spiritual, there's no metaphysical reality at all. It's just what you can see. We're here by accident. Some explosion happened at some time in the past and we just evolved and boom, here we are. And when you die, it's all over. There's nothing left. If this is a self-contained universe, then that means with the death of our Son, all life and all memory of all human existence will forever be erased, and it was all for nothing. And so, a 9-year-old kid that comes home from school, if that's the reality we live in, then sorry parents, but why are you making them do homework? What point is there to doing homework if you know that at the end of the day, it's all going to be for nothing with the death of our Son? Why are you going to work? Why are you loving your spouse? Why are you even worried about how your children turn out? It's all for nothing. That is a life of utter hopelessness. I mean, imagine for just a second that the doctor gives you the terrible news that, you know what, you have a life-threatening disease, and you know what, you've got 2 weeks to live. Whenever you know you've got 2 weeks to live, and if there is nothing beyond death, then I bet you're not going to work tomorrow. I bet you're not going to do anything. Because why? It's all for nothing. Why exert any effort at anything if it all is for nothing? Well, you stretch that out. It doesn't have to be 2 weeks from now. What if it's 100 years from now? The end result is the same. Living a life just for the seen is a life that is utter hopelessness. But if you live your life for the seen, for the unseen, rather than just for the seen, it is a life of hopefulness. And here's what I mean, a couple of illustrations of that. There was a study that was done back in May of this past year, done at Harvard. And those that were conducting the study surveyed Americans that regularly attend church, like on a very regular basis, to see what kind of results that you can expect from people who regularly attend religious services. And they found a direct correlation between those that attend religious services on a regular basis and a dramatic decrease in instances of depression, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse. Dramatic decrease. And so there's a very practical thing that says, well, wait a minute. There is something hopeful where you don't abandon in hopelessness to destructive behaviors because you've got something to hope in life. There's a direct correlation. Or better yet, in 1947, again at Harvard, there was a speech that was given by Howard Thurman, who is an African-American writer, who did a tremendous amount of study on African-American spirituals and their origin back in the days of slavery. You know, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and a lot of those old African American spirituals. He studied those and tried to determine what impact those spirituals had on the life of African Americans in times of slavery and beyond. And he comes to the conclusion in the study that he says the reason why those spiritual songs gave people in slavery such hope is because they were rooted in a firm confidence in the unseen world and Christian beliefs like heaven and God and that the day of judgment and one day God's going to make it all right. They had a firm belief in that. Now, Howard Thurman goes on to say, now, think about it for just a second. Imagine that you went to a slave in the early 1800s and you said to this person in extraordinary agony and terrible living conditions, and you said to that individual, now, guess what? I got something to tell you. God is not real. There is no heaven. There's nothing beyond this life. There is no judgment. But take heart. If you work really hard, if we all work really hard, one day at some point in the future, we will have an improved social policy. And at some point in the future, slavery will be outlawed. And there'll be an emancipation of the slaves. And there'll be a better life for blacks in America. Do you think that that would give somebody hopefulness that would allow them to get through the unbelievable torture of slavery? I mean, absolutely. What hope is that? What does it matter if there's an emancipation? What does it matter if there's improved social policy? If at the end of the day there is nothing beyond this life, what does it matter? And Howard Thurman goes on to say, no, the reason why the spiritual songs upheld that entire segment of our population and helped them to be able to get through that unspeakable agony is because they had an unbelievable confidence in the words that they were singing were not just fanciful words, but in fact were expressing the reality of the unseen world that they believe confidently in, that one day that things are going to be made right. One day justice will happen. There will be a judgment. God will make things fair, and there is a bright and better future ahead in heaven that is laid up for us. You see, whenever you believe that and you know that and you have a confidence of living for the unseen, not just the seen world, it gives real hope that just living for the seen world could never give. Now, it is understandable that the pandemic has caused many of us to reevaluate our commitments. Many people right now are sifting through all of the malice and the bitterness in our culture, and even malice and bitterness that has masqueraded as Christianity. And people are trying to sort through that and say, what of faith is left and is worth keeping? Many people right now are understandably weary, wounded, and tired. But I want to say to you this morning that that doesn't mean we should abandon faith. We need faith now more than ever. We must not abandon. Why abandon faith? The one thing you can hold on to, the one thing that is certain that transcends anything that we go through in this life. Why abandon faith for more emptiness? In 2005, the famous, well-known novelist and author David Foster Wallace, he spoke at a the commencement exercises at Kenyon College, and he said something because he was not really necessarily known to be a Christian believer. He was curious about Christianity and pondered it, but in that commencement speech, he pondered life's meaning before those students. You can get online and read the speech. It's pretty eye-opening, but there's one little part of the speech where he says, interestingly enough, there is actually no such thing as atheism. Now, as you can imagine, although he was not necessarily a believer, Atheists were up in arms over the fact that he would suggest such a thing. But at this commencement speech, he says, there's really no such thing as atheism. There is really no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. Everybody does. The only question is, what is it that you worship? The only choice you get is not whether you worship or whether you don't. The only choice you get is what you worship. And he goes on to say that he believes that the reason why worshiping some sort of God is compelling is because anything else in life that you would choose to worship, choose to devote your life to, choose to bow before and live for, if you choose anything else, it will consume you. He says, if you worship money, you will never have enough, and the pursuit of wealth will consume you. He says, if you worship beauty and sexual allure, it will consume you because you will always feel ugly and never beautiful enough. He says the reason you should choose to worship some sort of God, again, he's not a Christian believer, but he comes to the conclusion the reason it's compelling is because that's the only thing you can worship that instead of eating you alive will actually breathe life into you. So I would challenge all of us now. Why faith? Because embracing God is the only kind of life that will give you a steady direction. Embracing faith is the only kind of worship that will fill your life rather than eat you alive.